Greetings, and welcome to this chapter of A Virtual Introduction to Science Fiction. My name is David Higgins, and I'm a college professor and science fiction scholar at Inver Hills College in Minnesota. My lecture today is going to be on New Wave science fiction. The New Wave was a transatlantic avant-garde movement that occurred within science fiction during the 1960s and 1970s that had a lasting impact on the genre as a whole. New Wave writers were highly experimental. They wanted to develop a modern literary science fiction with advanced artistic techniques, and they focused on soft sciences like psychology and sociology rather than on hard sciences like physics and astronomy. The movement as a whole sought to subvert the pulp conventions that had dominated the genre since the Golden Age. A wide variety of authors were part of the New Wave movement. Some of them you may have heard of: J.G. Ballard, Samuel Delany, Ursula K. Le Guin, Joanna Russ, and Philip K. Dick have all achieved critical attention in the literary mainstream. Many others you may not have heard of, since they're primarily science fiction writers who are known within the field, and a short list of these might include Brian Aldiss, Barrington Bailey, John Brunner, Thomas Disch, Harlan Ellison, Philip Jose Farmer, M. John Harrison, Langdon Jones, Damon Knight, Michael Moorcock, Charles Pratt, James Salas, Robert Silverberg, John Sladek, Norman Spinrad, Roger Zelazny, and Pamela Zoline. I'm going to come back and talk about many of those later on, but first, in order to understand the New Wave, I think it's really important to understand some of the profound technological, social, and political changes that were occurring during the 1960s. All of these changes had a significant impact on the science fiction that was being produced at the time. In the Western world during the 1960s, there was an explosion of new technological advancements, and there were very deep social disagreements about the consequences of these new technologies. On the more optimistic side, some believed that new technological progress would lead mankind out into the stars. The Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, for example, eventually resulted in Neil Armstrong's historic moon landing in 1969, and many believe that this was just one early step toward an exciting and inevitable exploration of outer space. Others, however, were very concerned about the potential for new technologies to create negative and destructive changes for mankind. The first two world wars, which were very fresh in everyone's memories, had demonstrated that technological progress could sometimes enable terrible conflict and destruction on a scale that had been previously unimaginable in human history. Alongside these technological advancements, the 1960s were also a time of transformative social changes. Vibrant youth countercultures emerged throughout the Western world, and they were opposed to what they experienced as the conservatism and social conformity that had characterized Western life during the 1950s. These countercultures experimented boldly with psychedelic drugs, which were still mostly legal in the early 1960s. They rejected traditional limitations on sexual play, and they sparked a long-lasting sexual revolution, and they protested against America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Also during this time, the civil rights movement was transforming relations between whites and non-whites in the United States, and second-wave feminism and the gay rights movement were gaining momentum in their efforts to create greater social equality for women and homosexuals. All of these changes created an atmosphere of social tension in the West, and fears surrounding social change led to the assassinations of major public figures like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and John F. Kennedy. At least one other very significant change was also taking place in the 1960s. In the aftermath of World War II, Western European powers like Great Britain were losing their colonial empires as former colonies like India and Egypt won their independence and autonomy. At the beginning of the 20th century, if you go all the way back to the early 1900s, the sun never set on the British Empire, and at that time, Western European empires dominated the world. After World War II, however, Europe lost its colonial dominance, and two new empires emerged: the Soviet Union, which was devoted to the spread of communism, and the United States, which enjoyed a tremendous economic and political upsurge in the post-war period, and championed the expansion of capitalism throughout the world. All of these changes, technological, social, political, and imperial, were reflected in the transformations that occurred within science fiction during the 1960s. At this time, a new generation of writers emerged who wanted to rebel against what they viewed as the restrictive pulp limitations that had dominated science fiction writing during the previous eras. Many of these new wave authors had a very specific goal. They wanted to combine what they viewed as the best aspects of both science fiction and mainstream literary fiction into one new hybrid art form that had the best elements of both. The dominant trend in science fiction prior to the 1960s had often been to focus on big, interesting, fantastic scientific ideas. But this focus on ideas and on rich, extrapolative settings often came at the expense of a more sophisticated artistic development of characters, themes, and subtleties of tone, style, and language. Michael Moorcock, for example, wrote in 1963 that much of the science fiction prior to the 1960s lacked, quote, passion, subtlety, irony, original characterization, original and good style, a sense of involvement in human affairs, color, density, depth, and on the whole, real feeling from the writer, unquote. J.G. Ballard echoes Moorcock's sentiments in an article from 1962 in which he says, quote, "I've often wondered why science fiction shows so little of the experimental enthusiasm which has characterized painting, music, and cinema during the last 4 or 5 decades, particularly as these have become wholeheartedly speculative, more and more concerned with the creation of new states of mind, constructing fresh symbols and languages where the old ceased to be valid." New wave writers like Moorcock and Ballard wanted to draw upon avant-garde literary traditions and techniques in order to give science fiction ideas what they felt could be a more sophisticated and socially relevant artistic expression. On the technological front, new wave authors tended to display critical rather than optimistic views regarding scientific progress. Many of the futures that they imagined were bleak and dystopian rather than upbeat and hopeful. If the original Star Trek television series, which aired in the 1960s, represented a mainstream science fiction vision of a harmonious future in outer space, new wave imaginings instead often prophesized apocalyptic portents of doom and catastrophe. New wave writers also turned away from the hard sciences, such as physics, biology, and mathematics, which had really been the dominant focus of science fiction up until that time. And instead, they turned their attention towards soft sciences, psychology, sociology, sciences that were gaining a newfound widespread popular attention in the 1960s. If earlier science fiction had been characterized by an optimism surrounding technological progress, the new wave instead often focused on the scientific inevitability of entropy, breakdown, and decay. In his book, The Entropy Exhibition, an in-depth look at the British New Wave, Colin Greenland argues that entropy was the movement's central theme. And I think he's right. I think that many new wave writers were really focused on entropy. He says, quote, "The distinctive themes of new wave writers, ontological insecurity, alienation, the hostile and hidden dimensions of media and machines, the disintegration of objectivity into the subjective worlds of inner space, the dangerously exhilarating multiplication of possibilities. These are all primary concerns of their times, though new wave writers came to them rather in advance of popular assent. The concept of entropy, a degeneration inevitable from either over-organization or from chaos, is the center of this imaginative cluster. Hence, the frequency with which these writers return to the term and its fashionability, even for those who use it the least scientifically," unquote. Roger Luckhurst's book, Science Fiction, from 2005, situates the new wave emphasis on entropy within the historical context of decolonization. Luckhurst says that English science fiction transforms after 1945 due to the dismantling of the British Empire. He also observes that the UK produces a new round of disaster fictions after World War II, and that, quote, "the British disaster narrative always addressed disenchantment with the imperialist civilizing mission," unquote. Luckhurst views the emphasis on entropy in the British New Wave as a continuation of this science fiction disaster tradition. But instead of portraying these breakdowns as negatives, his key examples actively embrace and valorize entropic decay. To put that a little bit more simply, you have to imagine that during the 1940s and 1950s, Britain used to have this huge colonial empire, but during that time, from a British perspective, it was breaking down. Something that had been built, that had been very powerful, that had taken a lot of energy to organize, was collapsing in on itself. Now note, that's a British perspective rather than a perspective of, say, someone from India or from Egypt. The idea of entropy is that anything that's highly organized will eventually cool down and lose that level of organization. So your coffee, for example, might start off warm, but it eventually cools down. That's because of the second law of thermodynamics, or because of entropy. Many, at least among the British, they applied that idea of entropy to the decay of empire, and that was reflected in the science fiction of the time. So that's the new wave attitude towards technology and scientific progress. If mainstream science fiction was pro-scientific progress, all about brave new frontiers in space, Star Trek, all the rest of that, the new wave instead had a very pessimistic idea of scientific progress, and they thought of science as being something. They thought of progress as being something that was kind of a myth, right? That we believed in this myth of progress, but then actually things might be getting worse just as much as they were getting better. So in addition to all that technological stuff, New Wave authors also shared a commitment to challenging taken for granted social norms. If earlier science fiction narratives had often celebrated mainstream Western values, such as the male-dominated middle-class nuclear family, New Wave writers often used science fiction to challenge unspoken cultural assumptions about sex, race, gender, and other cultural norms. Female New Wave authors in particular were at the forefront of certain kinds of social critique. Pamela Zolin's short story, The Heat Death of the Universe — heat death is another one of those entropy references — her story suggests that a domestic housewife is asked to accomplish the same impossible and unfair work that Maxwell's demon is required to perform in the realm of thermodynamic physics. Kit Reed, another science fiction author, wrote moral fables that sharply criticized unfair social conditions. Her novel Armed Camps from 1969 tells the story of a decaying America where neither a male soldier nor a female pacifist can offer a solution to entropic decline. Sandra Dorman Hess and Zena Henderson both use alien characters to explore themes of race, immigration, and alienation. Dorman Hess's short story, When I Was Miss Dow, uses aliens as a tool to reflect on human conditions rather than as a racial enemy that should be eliminated. Finally, the New Wave also responded to the decline of Western European colonialism and the rise of the Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Before the 1960s, many science fiction stories celebrated an outward colonization of space and other worlds. Science fiction often drew on the patterns and tropes drawn from European colonial adventure narratives and American westerns to tell new stories about colonization and conquest in fantastic and imaginative locations like outer space. One iconic example is Edgar Rice Burroughs' story A Princess of Mars, recently remade into a terrible Disney movie called John Carter, in which the heroic John Carter demonstrates his mastery over Martian natives in order to eventually become their savior and leader. As John Reeder notes in his book Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction as a genre itself emerged during a period when European imperial expansion was at its peak, and much of early science fiction is concerned with the celebration of colonial conquest. To put this simply, in early science fiction, it was cool to be the person going out and conquering the unknown, colonizing other worlds, mastering savage natives who were somehow evolutionarily inferior to oneself. During the 1960s, however, everything changed. As Western European colonization was declining and many former colonies were winning their independence, suddenly colonialism begins to look like a bad thing rather than a shining heroic ideal. Before World War II, one might aspire to be a heroic colonialist in the West, because imperialism was associated with growth, expansion, adventure, and progress. After World War II, and in the aftermath of the collapse of European empires, imperialism became a bad word. It was a synonym for unjust and cruel domination. The Russians accused Americans of being imperialists, and vice versa. Both sides in the Cold War were fighting, at least ideologically, or at least in terms of their rhetoric, both sides in the Cold War were fighting to free the rest of the world from the imperialist influence of their counterparts. This shift in the meaning of imperialism was reflected profoundly in science fiction. Very few science fiction narratives in the 1960s celebrated the colonization of outer space. Think of Frank Herbert's Dune, for example, where the main character goes to the planet Arrakis and helps the locals there fight against the imperial influence of the Imperium from the outside. New Wave writers in particular were very highly critical of imperial and colonial expansion. In addition, many New Wave writers rejected outer space stories entirely in favor of exploring new frontiers of what they called inner space. J.G. Ballard, for example, wrote in his famous essay, Which Way to Inner Space, that the most exciting alien planet to explore was Earth itself. He said, quote, "The biggest developments of the immediate future will take place not on the Moon or Mars, but on Earth, and it is inner space, not outer, that needs to be explored. The only true alien planet is Earth." In the past, the scientific bias of science fiction has been towards the physical sciences, rocketry, electronics, cybernetics, and the emphasis should switch instead to the biological sciences. Accuracy, that last refuge of the unimaginative, doesn't matter a hoot. It is that inner spacesuit which is still needed, and it is up to science fiction to build it. This new wave emphasis on inner space rather than outer space explorations was influenced by avant-garde artistic movements that often emphasized the importance of defamiliarization, or the power of art to help us look at taken-for-granted things in a new and transformative way. The mid-century emergence of psychology and sociology as popular sciences that captured mainstream imagination, as well as the celebrity of certain radical anti-psychiatrists like R.D. Laing, also shaped the New Wave fascination with inner space. At the same time, however, one of the other major factors that motivated the New Wave turn towards inner space was the emergence of LSD and psychedelic counterculture. In the Entropy exhibition, that book I mentioned earlier, Colin Greenland suggests that the introduction of LSD played a major role in the development of the counterculture in the 1960s. He notes that during this time, a populist revolution against normative consensual reality spread from the west coast of America throughout Europe, and that during that time, an active psychedelic counterculture interested in exploring new terrains of perception and new modes of expression influenced the aesthetic and political agendas of New Wave science fiction. In this regard, New Wave writers stand alongside other artists and self-styled revolutionaries in the 1960s who were also interested in defining the subjectivity of inner space as a new frontier that should be explored for personal, social, and political growth in the face of ideological stagnation. John Hellman observes a similar agenda in the work of the New Journalists, writers such as Norman Mailer, Truman Capote, and Tom Wolfe. New journalism was similarly motivated with a dissatisfaction with consensual reality as it was portrayed by the mass media, and they were inspired by a desire to explore beyond this frontier of perception in order to gain access to a more authentic, subjective truth. Artists within the New Wave, New Journalism, and psychedelic counterculture, in the form of hallucinogenic pioneers like Ken Kesey and Timothy Leary, were united in their dissatisfaction with consensual reality and their determination to explore new, transgressive, subjective terrains of inner space. On the whole, then, New Wave writers were critical of technological progress, they were suspicious of national power and imperialism, and they were devoted to a celebration of cultural revolution. You could say that they were down with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, in a way that science fiction never had been before that. In many cases, New Wave writers emphasized the dystopian decay of Western culture in order to critique the social and political conditions of their time. In the next part of this lecture, I'm going to talk about the origins of the New Wave. Where exactly did the New Wave get started? The use of the term New Wave was borrowed from the French New Wave film movement during the 1950s and 1960s. French New Wave filmmakers at the time were loosely united by their deliberate rejection of highbrow cinema in favor of experimental subjects and radical techniques. Judith Merrill, who was an American expatriate writer and editor who lived in England and who published a very significant anthology of experimental science fiction stories called England Swings SF, might have been one of the first to have specifically borrowed the phrase New Wave to refer to the experimental science fiction of the period. But by the 1970s, wherever the origin came from, the term had come into common use to describe the seismic shift in science fiction style and content that characterized the era. The New Wave had several precursors. In the 1950s, Galaxy magazine and the Magazine of Science Fiction and Fantasy had started publishing more literary stories that were focused on average citizens rather than heroic scientists. And earlier science fiction authors like Alfred Bester and Lee Brackett had written unusual science fiction stories that broke the mold of pulp genre conventions in favor of a more literary and introspective style of tale. Despite these earlier precursors, however, most fans, writers, and historians agree that the New Wave truly crystallized in 1964, when Michael Moorcock took over as editor of the British science fiction magazine New Worlds. He began publishing weird science fiction stories featuring avant-garde narratives that became characteristic of the New Wave movement. John Wyndham, a famous British science fiction writer of the earlier generation, he had written many stories, including the more famous Day of the Triffids. Wyndham had published science fiction stories quite extensively in the pages of New Worlds magazine before Moorcock took over as the magazine's editor. And I think that you can really see a distinction between the two eras of science fiction by thinking of Wyndham on one side and Moorcock on the other. If Wyndham and his contemporaries represented a period of outward emphasis in science fiction, Moorcock and his crew represented in many ways the opposite. Wyndham was interested in outer space, Moorcock was concerned with inner space. Wyndham focused on physics and astronomy, Moorcock emphasized psychology and sociology. Wyndham's generation was optimistic and expansive. Moorcock's generation was critical, some would say pessimistic, and apocalyptic. Brian Aldiss notes that under Moorcock's guidance at New Worlds, quote, galactic wars went out, drugs came in. There were fewer encounters with aliens, more encounters in the bedroom. Experimentation with prose styles became one of the orders of the day, and the baleful influence of William Burroughs often threatened to gain the upper hand, unquote. Stephen P. Lockwood notes that Moorcock repeatedly articulated three core goals of the New Wave in the pages of New Worlds. He said that first, the movement struggled to revitalize science fiction by breaking down habitual forms and stagnant genre structures. Two, it sought to create a new form of fiction that amalgamated modern fiction and science fiction. And three, it aspired to convince publishers and fans of the seriousness of science fiction as a valid literary form. And scholars had not taken science fiction very seriously at all prior to the 1960s. There is maybe one or two scholars, Kingsley Amos, Martin Amos, one of the Amoses wrote a book about science fiction at the time, but very few scholars or people in the academy or people in the literary world thought of science fiction anything other than as juvenile entertainment, similarly to the way that people thought about comics and graphic fiction until very recently. In struggling towards these three goals, New Wave writers were almost universally united, and science fiction critic Peter Nichols argues that despite many internal differences, the New Wave, quote, did more than any other kind of science fiction to break down the barriers between science fiction and mainstream fiction. Michael Moorcock's most active collaborators and fellow contributors at New Worlds were Brian Aldiss and J.G. Ballard, and each sought to look for examples and inspirations outside the science fiction canon. Many New Wave writers were interested in William Burroughs, the author of Naked Lunch, rather than in Edgar Rice Burroughs, as had many of the authors before them, as a guiding muse. And some stories, like Philip Jose Farmer's The Jungle Rot Kid on the Nod and Barrington Bailey's The Four Color Problem, were both pastiches of Burroughs' style of work. New Worlds also celebrated Mervyn Peake's weird gothic Gormenghast trilogy, a strange surrealistic fantasy series published between 1946 and 1959. And the magazine, New Worlds, was also one of the first science fiction publications to actively identify the works of magical realist authors like Jorge Luis Borges as akin to their own style of literary science fiction imaginings. Not everyone in the science fiction world, however, appreciated the stylistic and topical innovations of the New Wave. Many writers and fans who enjoyed the concrete, hard science explorations of classic science fiction found the kinds of fictions emerging from New Worlds to be disjointed, disorienting, iconoclastic, and queer. Isaac Asimov, who later wrote many popular science fiction stories that were within the science fiction tradition, once famously said, quote, "I hope that when the new wave has deposited its froth and receded, the vast and solid shore of science fiction will appear once more," unquote. Algis Budrys, a science fiction writer who had also gained fame for writing and editing more traditional science fiction stories in the 1950s, wrote a powerful denunciation of J.G. Ballard's style of fiction in the pages of Galaxy magazine. He said, quote, "A story by J.G. Ballard, as you know, calls for people who don't think. One begins with characters who regard the physical universe as a mysterious and arbitrary place, and who would not dream of trying to understand its actual laws. Furthermore, in order to be the protagonist of a J.G. Ballard novel, or anything other than a minor character therein, you have to cut yourself off from the entire body of scientific education. In this way, when a world disaster, be it wind or water, comes upon you, you are under absolutely no obligation to do anything but sit and worship the catastrophe. Even more further, some force is acted to remove from the face of the world all people who might impose good sense or rational behavior on you, so that the disaster proceeds unchecked and unopposed, except by the almost inevitable thumb rule engineer type for who his individual comfort builds a huge pyramid with huge footings to resist high winds, or trains a herd of alligators and renegade divers to help him out in dealing with deep water," unquote. These comments reveal many of the central presumptions of the more traditional style of science fiction that had been inherited from the Golden Age pulp era. According to Budrys's view, a proper science fiction story portrays the universe as a place of actual laws, which can be understood and mastered through a proper scientific education deployed by people with good sense and rational behavior. Michael Moorcock, Brian Aldiss, and J.G. Ballard joyfully mock these presuppositions with satirical wit and vigor. If there are actual laws that dominate the physics of the universe, according to the New Wavers, these are likely to be complex beyond the hubris of human understanding, and they will always inevitably intersect with the equally, if not more complex, and much more neglected laws of human psychology, sociology, and sexuality, in ways that traditional science fiction, with its masterful engineer heroes and plucky female girlfriend sidekicks, usually just ignore. In the view of New Wave authors, a scientific education has to go beyond math and physics into the much more complex and subjective world of human psychology. And when science fiction stops taking for granted that good sense and rational behavior are universal characteristics that are recognizable to everyone, a much more complex view of humanity emerges that reveals that what often looks like rational behavior is often actually a mythicized European and American ideology of technological progress that can lead directly to Hiroshima and Nazi concentration camps, just as easily as it can lead to a progressive technological utopia. J.G. Ballard, in particular, rejected what he saw as the naive optimism of traditional genre science fiction in favor of a more realistic view, or what he thought of as a more realistic view, of the complexity of human character. Ballard says this in his book, The Atrocity Exhibition. He says, quote, "I think that we're all perhaps innately perverse, capable of enormous cruelty, yet paradoxically, our talent for the perverse, the violent, and the obscene may be a good thing. We may have to go through this phase in order to reach something on the other side. It's a mistake to hold back and refuse to accept one's own true nature," unquote. Although New Worlds under Moorcock's editorship was clearly one locus of New Wave activity, the movement in a larger sense was occurring in several locations simultaneously. Judith Merrill anthologized many New Wave stories in her England Swings SF collection in 1968, and also in her annual Year's Best Science Fiction anthologies. Also, Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions anthologies, starting in 1967, were often considered to be the birthplace of the American New Wave. Brooks Landon, a science fiction scholar from the University of Iowa, notes that Dangerous Visions was, quote, innovative and influential before it had any readers, simply because it was the first big original anthology of science fiction, offering prices to its writers that were competitive with the magazines. The readers soon followed, however, attracted by 33 stories by science fiction writers both well-established and relatively unheard of. These writers responded to editor Harlan Ellison's call for stories that could not be published elsewhere or had never been written in the face of almost certain censorship by SF editors. Among the stories Ellison received were the Joycean Riders of the Purple Wage by Philip Jose Farmer, and some other stories that he mentions. To SF readers, especially in the US, Dangerous Visions certainly felt like a revolution, and it marks an emblematic turning point for American science fiction, unquote. Indeed, Dangerous Visions was a turning point, not just in terms of its content, but also in terms of its very format. Prior to the 1960s, most science fiction had been published as short stories or serials in magazine form, and magazines often had editorial policies that limited the range of authors' more radical expressions. In the 1960s, however, a significant book market emerged in the United States, and for the first time, science fiction was being widely published in book form, as we usually experience it today, rather than in magazine format. Books had a much greater range of content and a wider diversity of audience. Many new kinds of stories were published in books and anthologies that would have not been welcome in magazines. And eventually the magazines themselves had to become more open in their editorial policies in order to remain relevant. This transition in science fiction publishing from magazine format to book format is actually one of the most long-lasting and revolutionary transformations to emerge from the New Wave period. If you're a science fiction writer, ask yourself, if you're a young science fiction writer, ask yourself, have you read very much science fiction in magazines recently? And maybe now we're actually seeing a transition where there's a lot of short fiction being published online. But most people in the younger generation now are really reading science fiction in book form rather than in magazines. But if you were reading science fiction in the early 1960s, almost everything that you read or would have read would have been happening in magazines rather than in books. So this was a big transformation. Alongside Dangerous Visions, which was sort of the birthplace of the American New Wave, Damon Knight also published a series of anthologies called Orbit, beginning in 1966. And this was also a key publication site for innovative new work coming out of the Milford Writers' Workshop, which later transformed and evolved into the Clarion Workshops, which are still very popular today. Some people also add Robert Silverberg's New Dimensions anthologies beginning in 1971 as a fifth New Wave publication site, but by this time the impact of the New Wave had become widespread in the science fiction world. In hindsight, it's very clear that something new was occurring in science fiction throughout Britain and America during this time, and we now look back and refer to the entire phenomenon collectively as the New Wave. At the time, however, science fiction writers and editors had very strong disagreements about what exactly was happening and whether these new innovations that were sweeping the SF field had anything to do with one another. In Dangerous Visions, Harlan Ellison hastens to distinguish his project from the work of his British counterparts. Quote, "My new thing is neither Judith Merrill's new thing nor Michael Moorcock's new thing. Ask for us by our brand names," quote, unquote. Similarly, Thomas Disch, an American writer who moved to England during the peak of New Wave activity in the 1960s, initially denied any affiliation with the movement at all. In 1978, he said, quote, "I have no opinion of the New Wave in science fiction, since I don't believe there ever was a meaningful classification. If you mean to ask, do I feel solidarity with all writers who've ever been lumped together under the heading? Certainly I do not," unquote. But 2 decades later in 1998, he says, quote, "My sense of the New Wave, with 25 years of hindsight, is that its irreducible nucleus was the dyad of J.G. Ballard and Michael Moorcock, with Ballard in the role of T.S. Eliot and Moorcock as Ezra Pound, a Svengali for all seasons, ready to welcome anyone into the club who might in some way advance the cause," unquote. Despite some attempts to distinguish between the British and American movements, however, a wide variety of American writers, including Dish, Norman Spinrad, and John Sladek, actually moved to London in the 1960s to be part of the New Worlds publishing circle, and a large number of British New Worlds writers, including J.G. Ballard and Brian Aldiss, published short stories in Ellison's Dangerous Visions, and the subsequent volume, again Dangerous Visions. Despite the fact that they often denied association with one another completely, it's clear that there were strong connections between the writers of the New Wave and between the kinds of creative projects that they were pursuing. In historical hindsight, we might say that the New Wave was one movement erupting from multiple places all at once, heterogeneous yet flush with a kind of overwhelming momentum to transform the field. Many histories of the New Wave have described it as a movement that was dominated by men, but I think that that's incorrect. This characterization neglects many women's contributions that occurred during the time. Several very important women published in the pages of New Worlds, including Hilary Bailey, Sandra Dorman, Catherine MacLean, Judith Merrill, Kit Reed, and Pamela Zoline. And there's many more too, that's just a short list. New Worlds also included poetry by Libby Houston, as well as nonfiction articles by women, including things that were written by Joyce Churchill and Judy Watson. Dangerous Visions also included work by several women, including Ursula K. Le Guin, Joanna Russ, Josephine Saxon, and James Tiptree. And many of these authors also published in the Orbit anthologies. Orbit also featured fiction by women like Eleanor Aronson, Carol Carr, and there's a whole list of others, Virginia Kidd, etc., etc. Women were active in the New Wave, both as writers and as editors. I've already mentioned that Judith Merrill moved to England and published England Swings SF in 1968. She continued to support New Wave experimentation and publication even after she returned to America. She also wrote the very famous story That Only a Mother, a story about a woman who believes that her mutant baby is normal. This story chillingly calls into question the relative madness of the murderous father who seeks to kill the child, and the warlike atomic society that is responsible for its creation. Hilary Bailey is also an important figure. She was married to Michael Moorcock from 1962 through 1962 through 1978, and she was the co-editor and sometimes sole editor of New Worlds Quarterly, which was an anthology that succeeded New Worlds magazine. Her work was often fiction in a mainstream style, but she was also known for her short story, The Fall of Frenchie Steiner, and she co-wrote The Black Corridor with Moorcock without actually receiving authorial credit. Kate Wilhelm and her husband Damon Knight founded the Milford Science Fiction Writers Conference, which, as I said, later became Clarion. Wilhelm also edited a Clarion anthology in the 1970s, and her short story, The Planners, she won a Nebula for her short story, The Planners, which was a story of a collapsing near-future USA and an unstable protagonist. So in this last section, I just want to take a couple of moments to introduce you to a few books. I went over my shelf and I wanted to pull every New Wave book that I had because they're fascinating. Many of them are really, really interesting. But I picked out what I thought was a good starting point for your reading of New Wave science fiction if you're interested. The first thing is you have to read short stories. Many of the most important things that were happening in the New Wave were happening in magazines. If you can actually get to an archive, if you happen to be near UC Riverside, for example, and you can actually go into an archive and look at old issues of New Worlds or some of the other magazines at the time, that would be a great way to get an introduction to the New Wave. But if you don't have access to an archive, there's two books that have been republished. One, this is an anthology called New Worlds, edited by Michael Moorcock, and it's a collection of many of the most famous and long-lasting short stories that emerged out of the pages of New Worlds. So again, New Worlds was the magazine that Moorcock started publishing in 1964. That was kind of the birthplace of the British New Wave, and this book collects together many of the stories that were really hot in that magazine at the time. It's also got a really good introduction, and it's got a really good introduction by Moorcock, and it also republishes some of the articles, which is one of the great things. If you get into studying the New Wave, it's really worthwhile to go and look at some of the nonfiction articles that were being published in the magazines. So, New Worlds by Moorcock. Also, I would say check out Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions. This gets republished every few years. This was the quote-unquote birthplace of the American New Wave. So if you're looking for short stories, and I know many people these days tend to be readers of novels, but to really get the New Wave, you got to look at some of the short stories. I would say New Worlds for the British New Wave, Dangerous Visions for the American New Wave. And there's great short stories by a wide variety of authors in both volumes. All right, then to move on to some other things, Michael Moorcock, who we've already talked about, published many things, but one of his quintessential New Wave fiction attempts was the Cornelius. This has been collected together as the Cornelius Quartet, but these were several different novellas. One was called The Final Program, the second was called A Cure for Cancer. These are all about a character named Jerry Cornelius, who is it's Michael Moorcock's weird reinterpretation of James Bond, all right? Jerry Cornelius is weak and pitiful, whereas James Bond is powerful and masterful. Jerry Cornelius is transsexual at times. They're wonderful. They're sort of crazy psychedelic counterculture espionage tales that take the James Bond thing in a whole different direction. So there's all kinds of fun stuff there. Brian Aldiss was actually a writer who had actually gained most of his fame in the 1940s and 1950s. He was actually one of the main writers from the earlier generation who went New Wave in Britain in the 1960s. And this book, called Barefoot in the Head, is a weird dystopian tale about what would happen if an enemy from outside Britain bombed the UK with psychedelic bombs, right? So basically all these, instead of being bombed with nuclear weapons, they've been bombed with LSD weapons. And so everyone in Britain is perpetually tripping on acid all the time. And so you get this story, Barefoot in the Head. It's a weird combination of Gurdjieffian mysticism. If you don't know who Gurdjieff is, go look him up. He's a lot of fun. It's a weird combination of Gurdjieffian mysticism and psychedelic playful parody. Really wonderful, weird book. J.G. Ballard is an author who's gained a lot of attention for his literary fiction. He wrote Crash, which was turned into a movie by, I think, David Cronenberg. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but he wrote this book called Crash, which was about sex and car crashes. It was about people who liked to have sex while they were in cars that were crashing. Very strange book, turned into a very strange film. Everything that J.G. Ballard does is pretty strange. In science fiction, he wrote The Terminal Beach. This is a collection of his stories, The Terminal Beach. They're all strangely post-apocalyptic. He also put together this weird volume called The Atrocity Exhibition, which is, there's all these strange illustrations and things that are in here. He does weird things in here, like slowly dissect Marilyn Manson, Marilyn Monroe. That's terrible. Sorry about that. He slowly dissects public figures like Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy. This is where he really plays with that kind of perversity that he was talking about earlier. These are weird, wonderful stories that are really, this is not like an ongoing science fiction narrative. It's kind of more like a William Burroughs cut-up in a lot of ways. And it's really interesting, so check that out if you would like. Other interesting things to look at. Norman Spinrad's book, Bugjack Baron, was one of the stories that was so controversial that they had trouble publishing it in the pages of New Worlds. It has to do with race and race relations. I don't think we would find it to be tremendously controversial by contemporary standards, but it was a hot button story during the time. Thomas Dish wrote Camp Concentration. This is a really classic New Wave story. It's about a future America that's been taken over by totalitarian fundamentalists, and they lock up conscientious objectors and other weirdos and experiment on them with psychedelic drugs until eventually they become subversive geniuses who outthink their prisoners, who outthink their prison guards, and move on to sort of take over and escape. Philip K. Dick, you're probably familiar with from the Blade Runner, which was first Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. One of his books that you might take a look at is The Man in the High Castle. It's an alternate history that tells a story about what would have happened if the Nazis and the Japanese had won World War II and divided the United States up into a Nazi section and a Japanese section, and Americans kind of live, like white Americans, particularly a variety of former Americans live as like second-class citizens in this state. There's a bunch of weird stuff about the I Ching in here. It's really fun. One of my favorite authors is Samuel Delany. He is a really interesting and complicated writer. He is, let's see, a good starting place to look at his new wave work would be the Einstein intersection. It's short, very interesting, gets into reworking of myths for contemporary purposes. It's kind of like a science fiction western, but it's all weird and strange. Once you're done with that and you want a real challenge, you can read Samuel Delany's Dahlgren, which is kind of the Moby Dick of science fiction, right? It is a complicated experimental novel with lots of queer sex and other stuff like that. Delany has a reputation for being a really unique figure in the science fiction world. He was a black, gay, dyslexic science fiction writer with a very strong emphasis on language and critical theory. His work is really, it combines a really beautiful sense of soul and sensitivity of spirit with some of the most complex experiments in language and theory that you could possibly imagine. So check out Delany, he's one of my favorites. But start with the Einstein intersection or Babel 17 or Nova. Move on to Dahlgren when you're really ready for a challenge. Last up, several women were very prominent in the new wave. Ursula K. Le Guin, many of you have heard of her for writing the Earthsea trilogy or other things like that. She has a couple of novels, The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed, that are really classics. Anyone who reads science fiction should read these novels. They're really, really good stuff. And last up, Joanna Russ, probably on the more radical edge of feminist new wave science fiction, writes the novel The Female Man, which is about, well, it's complicated. It's a story that brings together the perspective of different women who are different kinds of feminists or not feminists from different worlds, and they're interacting with one another. And it's a really interesting book. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's really great stuff. So I've taken too long now and probably over time, but that's a short list of things to get you started. And after you've read those, then you'll be in it, and there are many other things that you would want to read as well. So I hope that you've enjoyed. I hope this has been an enjoyable and useful lecture for you. I want to thank Lars for inviting me to give this lecture, and I hope that you enjoy the reading.